I'm Tom Cheshire, standing in for Neil Patterson. Do make sure you're following us on your podcast app for your weekday analysis of the biggest stories. Today, Russia joins the USA in Saudi Arabia for talks about the war in Ukraine. We'll explore what it all means after this.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Senior Russian and American officials around a giant wooden table, flowers in the middle, flags at the back of the room. Russian and American flags, though, not Ukrainian or European. I think the phrase is NFI'd. This was a significant moment. Those sitting down included Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, and the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. There hadn't been anything like this since the invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago. Now, the US says the talks were, quote, the first step of a long and difficult journey. Both sides have appointed teams to negotiate ending the war. They met in Riyadh, and that is significant for Saudi Arabia, once a pariah state, now fast becoming a leading player in brokering peace deals. We'll be talking about the new geopolitical role the kingdom is carving out for itself later. But first, Deborah Haynes, our security and defence editor, who watched on from Kyiv, on just what a significant moment this has been. Deborah, there's two things here, right? It's the speed and the scale. First of all, we've had 3 years of grinding warfare, and it looks like things are moving to a head very, very quickly. It could all perhaps be agreed, and we can talk about what agreement means by spring. But also the scale of this moment. You know, this is the foreign secretaries effectively of both Russia and the US meeting. How important is this moment?
Well, just on the speed and the scale, it's really hard to imagine. This would never have happened under the previous administration. There was always this sense of Ukraine, the US, the Europeans, other allies all working together to support Kyiv. And yet here we are in a dizzying few weeks since Donald Trump took office. And there are these high-level talks that have just taken place in Saudi Arabia, seemingly making deals with each other with neither Ukraine nor the Europeans in the room.
Yeah, no Ukraine. The sands of Saudi Arabia, a long way from the snows of Kyiv. I mean, what's the mood like? Does it feel like not being invited to, you know, not just a party, that's very flippant, but, you know, the whole future of your country being decided? What do people in Kyiv feel like? What's their take on it?
There's huge anxiety. There's a sense of helplessness because the United States is the strong power here. And what Donald Trump has said, I mean, he set a big part of his election campaign. He sort of talked about how he would end the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine, within 24 hours. And clearly that's not happened yet. He's pushing very quickly to try to get the two sides to negotiate. I think for Ukraine, they are currently having to take the US at its word when the US says that this meeting in Saudi Arabia is about actually just finding out whether or not the Russians are serious about negotiations. And then you've got Keith Kellogg, Trump's envoy to Ukraine, coming to Kyiv in the next 24 hours. And he is going to be meeting with President Zelensky. And that is, you know, the US showing that it's speaking to the Ukrainians as well. But the choreography isn't good. And also the messaging from Moscow is dire. Clearly the Russians view the Americans as the people that they want to negotiate with and come to some kind of agreed terms, not directly with the Ukrainians. And that really is a problem.
I mean, I suppose that's also because, you know, Ukraine and Russia are so far apart on what constitutes a fair peace. Ukraine point out the aggressor shouldn't be setting those terms. It seems to be happening slightly at the moment. Is there any sense of a possible middle ground where they could meet? I mean, Russia seems to be pretty maximalist in what it wants from this, and it seems pretty confident of getting that.
Yes, and I think that's really important what you just said about whether there can be middle ground here. And I think that's something that observers of the war and Ukrainians themselves are finding deeply uncomfortable. The way that the language is framed is really as if the US is talking to two sides as opposed to being on Ukraine's side I mean, maybe that's just how Donald Trump wants to do his diplomacy, but that goes down like a bucket of sick. In Ukraine, where, Russia is the enemy. Russia invaded this country. Russian aggression has killed so many people here, pushed millions from their homes, upended lives. And right now you have hundreds of thousands of troops mobilized, fighting Russian forces to keep hold of their territory.
I mean, yeah, it is mind-boggling when you put it like that, in terms of the US is approaching this almost like a neutral party, a mediator, when in fact, it's been the biggest backer of Ukraine in terms of weaponry, in terms of aid, in terms of loans as well. And I suppose, when we're talking about passing the sick bucket, one of the things that might also have stuck in the throat for Ukraine is this idea of the US getting access to some of Ukraine's minerals, its oil and gas. How is that sort of idea being received?
So Volodymyr Zelensky presented his peace plan late last year, which included this idea about how Ukraine is a resource-rich country and how the US and other allies could benefit from that. But from the sort of leaked reporting that's come out about the text of what was proposed by the Americans to Kyiv, it is pretty extraordinary. It's a sort of wholesale surrender of large amounts of Ukraine's natural wealth, and it really is uncomfortable, but also revealing of the weakness that Ukraine has in terms of its ability to be able to ensure that its demands are being heard and delivered. Ukraine's made very clear no deal can be done without it at the table.
The Europeans do not have a seat at this table in Riyadh. And, is that fair, especially given how much Europe has eventually, slowly, but got over the line in terms of military aid? They're not part of that negotiations. How frustrated are European leaders with that?
It's devastating for European leaders, and it's a massive wake-up call, which, people inside defence and security circles have been painfully aware of for so long, about Europe's weakness when it comes to military capability and that military strength enabling a country to have a voice at the table. The fact that Europe has been so rapidly sidelined by the Trump administration is a humiliation. But the fact that it is the Americans and the Russians sitting down right now in Saudi Arabia is massively uncomfortable for Europe. And the big question is whether or not they react to that in a way that ensures this never happens again.
We'll pause there for a break. When we return, we'll go back to Saudi Arabia and why they've become the power broker for Trump's New World Order.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kelnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
So, Saudi Arabia and its leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, have been investing heavily in diplomacy. Why? Well, with me is Dr. Lina Khatib, Associate Fellow, Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. Why are Russia and the US meeting in Riyadh? Riyadh is a long way from Kyiv, it's a long way from Moscow. Why Saudi Arabia?
It's because of the evolving relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States. I mean, of course, this meeting is about Russia and Ukraine, not about the Middle East. So theoretically speaking, the US could have picked somewhere else for this meeting to be held. But the choice of Saudi Arabia is about US-Saudi relations, which are stronger than ever, really.
And does that bring anything in particular for Ukraine? We've seen Saudi Arabia involved in other sorts of negotiations, especially in the Middle East, its development, as a growing influence. But when it comes to Ukraine, are they bringing any of their own interest there, any of their own expertise?
I wouldn't read the meeting as being about what Saudi Arabia is offering Ukraine or Russia, but about what Saudi Arabia is gaining itself in terms of its ambition to become a global power, in terms of the close relationship between Donald Trump and the Saudi authorities. Even at the height of the Russia-Ukraine war, Saudi Arabia kept relations open with both countries. So in a way, this has made Saudi Arabia quite well placed to host such a meeting.
Is it also, this change in administration, Donald Trump as president, is someone the Saudi Arabians are a lot more comfortable doing business with, and they don't want to disappoint him in a way perhaps they were happier with disappointing President Biden?
I mean, the first Trump administration was one in which relations between the US and Saudi Arabia became closer. The Biden administration saw a change in that sentiment. I mean, from the very beginning, President Biden had said quite critical things about Saudi Arabia. He later walked back on some of the statements he had made, but we can definitely say that the Biden administration was not an administration that enjoyed close relations with Saudi Arabia. With Trump, there are business interests at play and political interests. And so for the Saudi authorities, seeing Trump back in power means an opportunity that they definitely want to capitalize on to increase their own political position in the world. And for the Trump administration, they also need a trusted partner in the Arab world.
That is quite the journey, given it did have pariah status as a state after the murder in 2018 of Jamal Khashoggi. No one would speak to it. Since then, it seems to have repaired it, and people are willing to forget what happened. How has it been able to do that?
Well, it has been able to really invest in the infrastructure in the country. And by this, I mean not just economically, but also the political and geopolitical infrastructure. We have seen reforms happen in Saudi Arabia over the past few years that some had thought were almost impossible. Things like the liberalization and modernization that are going on in the kingdom. To see Saudi Arabia become a hub for music, for sports, and also to invest in its diplomatic service. This is something that Saudi Arabia had been cultivating for years. So it has been a gradual process of professionalization and investment in things that are not just cosmetic. I mean, this is not just about image. This is a real investment in the economic infrastructure of the country so that it becomes attractive to investors and to business engagement internationally. Saudi Arabia has been doing all those things simultaneously under the leadership of the Crown Prince. So this has helped present Saudi Arabia as credible in terms of where it is today.
Is there a limit to that sort of modernization? As you say, these aren't cosmetic changes, but at the heart of it, this is still a repressive regime in terms of human rights. It's still the regime that is responsible, as many countries believe, for the murder of a journalist. At the same time, you've got a conservative society that may not be happy with some of these changes. There's only so far that road can really run when it's made those changes, but actually it's a fundamentally different regime, an authoritarian regime.
Saudi Arabia remains an absolute monarchy. But when it comes to the issues that Saudi Arabia finds challenging, actually, if you zoom out and look at the rest of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia is not unique in the issues it faces. And so what the US is doing is not linking its engagement with Saudi Arabia to any of the issues regarding governance or regarding human rights or any of those other issues. I feel that the US is being quite pragmatic in the way it's engaging with Saudi Arabia. And one thing I will say on the human rights issue is that despite continuing problems, of course, there has been significant progress as well in Saudi Arabia, such as when it comes to women. I mean, famously, women were not allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia not too long ago. And now they are not just driving, but we see key women in high-profile diplomatic positions in the business world, in the sports world, in the arts world. And so the situation is gradually changing. And I think it would be unrealistic to expect a country that has for decades been conservative to all of a sudden overnight become quite liberal in the way it conducts its affairs. And so the country now is really reclaiming how it was before the ultra-conservatism kind of took off in the kingdom. So in many ways, these changes that I'm talking about are also not unfamiliar to Saudi society.
I suppose it is one thing too to host this summit, as you say, sort of neutral parties almost, Saudi Arabia in the middle, where it's much more of an active party, where things are perhaps more complicated is the situation in Gaza, the ongoing ceasefire, the hopes to turn that into sort of a permanent peace. What's Saudi Arabia's position in that? And do things like today complicate that? Are there different factors at play? What are the challenges there?
When it comes to the Israel-Palestine issue, it is Saudi Arabia that brought the Arab countries together and more than 2 decades ago came up with something called the Arab Peace Initiative, which is basically a proposal to reach peace. And Saudi Arabia has never given up on the Arab Peace Initiative, which is basically an initiative to say, let's restart the peace process and work towards a two-state solution. Saudi Arabia remains committed to this. And so Saudi Arabia has to maneuver quite carefully around these kinds of pronouncements from the White House, bearing in mind that now it seems there is wide awareness in the Middle East and elsewhere that Donald Trump's negotiating style seems to be one based on starting with maximalist, almost impossible demands that are then walked back on to kind of reach some sort of compromise. And it seems that these kinds of statements are deliberately made to spur other countries into action. And it seems that President Trump does this with opponents and allies alike. So I think that, the Saudis have enough experience with Donald Trump that I think they will know how to maneuver.
That is all for this episode of the Sky News Daily. Don't forget to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back tomorrow.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.